Tonight, as you know, we're doing halfway through the series, 7 out of 14, the 7th lecture of this era called the Ben Gurion era at high noon. I hope by now you see that I don't have to keep repeating myself. There is a very definite character to the late 50s. In Israel and the Jews, 1957 to 61. Tonight, I entitled The Irresistible Force versus the Immovable Object. Israel and the Arab world in the age of Nasser. And I hope to make the case tonight. We're spending a lot of time on context. That's what history is about. It's not just a matter of telling stories or facts or showing funny videos. Israel reacts to this, and without any further ado, I begin. If you're an Arab, okay. Is it okay? Can you hear? It is good? I'm not talking to you. You can all, is it okay? Okay, fine. If you're an Arab, even today, things have been bad in one fashion or another for 1,000 years. Okay, so it's an interesting perspective. If you're an American, you don't necessarily look at the past that way, but if you're an Arab, things have been bad for 1,000 years. Once upon a time, look what they controlled, and this was a single country. In the 600s and the early 700s, it's a long time ago, they conquered this huge area by force of arms, and they created a great empire with a single capital. For a long time, for example, it was at Baghdad, and in its heyday, it was gigantic, from India to the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see. Now, they created a whole civilization. In its heyday, Islam was a subordinate part of the Arab civilization, right? It was the face of Arab civilization. Now, I'm talking to you how an Arab looks at things. I'm not talking to you, for example, how an Indonesian who's a Muslim looks at things, right? I'm not talking to you possibly how an African from Nigeria who's a Muslim looks at things. I'm talking about if you're an Arab, particularly if you're an Arab, like Arabia and those kind of places. So yes, Islam came along and Muhammad and all that, and yes, they conquered a huge empire, and yes, they brought this dramatic religion to the world, no question about it. But it was in Arabic. Muhammad spoke Arabic. The Quran is in Arabic. The lands that they conquered, they Arabized, among other things, okay? The conquered countries, means this whole area was not only Islamized, that is to say, not only did they spread over the course of time, it wasn't overnight, but over the course of time, the Islamic religion, but they Arabed everybody. You understand? So, for example, take a look at the next picture, if we can. No. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, great. He says, well, that's not exactly what I was looking for, but okay, it's fine. Let me make the point. Here's Iran. You know that. At that time, Iran was actually even bigger. Think about what I'm about to tell you. The Arabs spent 20 years fighting to conquer Iran. The Persians fought like crazy not to be conquered by the Arabs. This in the 630s and 640s. With a bloody business. And it didn't happen overnight. And when they conquered one part, the Iranians tried to counterattack. And the Persians were Zoroastrians. They weren't Arabs. They weren't Muslims. And they bitterly resented the imposition, number one, of a foreign religion on the land that had for a long time been Zoroastrian, the Persians. And number two, they bitterly resented the fact that some foreign group called the Arabs, who they really, from the Persian point of view, they really considered sand jockeys. That is what they looked at him like. That they're coming in now and conquering us. You understand? And so it wasn't an easy business. In the end, they did conquer the Persians, and they did shove it down their throat, the Arab language, and the Islamic religion, and the Arab culture, and everything that goes along with that. And to a certain degree, the Persian culture was suppressed. So if you lived in the 700s, 800s, and all those hundreds in that part of the world, it wasn't speaking Iranian much anymore, a little bit. But basically, it was all Arab. But the Iranians hated this. And after a while, even in the Middle Ages, they sort of found the opportunity culturally to counterattack culturally and to bring back the Persian stuff. So they didn't get rid of the religion stuff. And actually, Iran, believe it or not, was a Sunni country for many centuries. So many don't know that. So he says, they did keep the religion stuff, but they did get rid of what they called the foreign invading colonialist Arab stuff. So I'm simply trying to give you an example of a country, and a very important one. In world affairs today, I don't have to tell you, the whole Arabs are quaking from Iran because they're getting A-bomb. But I'm trying to show you that even though we think, oh, it's all one big Muslim blob and all the rest, it's not exactly like that. And there are very important language and cultural distinctions that matter a lot in the Middle East. And the Iranians are very proud of the fact that they kicked the Arabs the heck out of there. And it shows you that if Iran is a country, and there are a couple others, when I say Iran, it's also other parts, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the other stands over there. They all have this in common, what I just told you. They were Arabized and then they threw the Arabs out of there. So they did retain the Muslim religion, but they did not retain the Arabic language. But that means, by contrast, that all the other countries failed to do what I just described to you. As the Egyptians were not able to do, it didn't happen in Egypt, what I just described happened in Iran. They never did get rid of the Arabization stuff, or the Syrians, or the Iraqis, if you wish, or the Moroccans, or the Algerians, and so forth. So all this stuff matters. And when we will talk today, for example, an Arab world, what do they mean by that term? It's where Arabic is spoken, and the Arab language, the Arab literature and Arab culture is still there, which was shoved down their throat once upon a time. But these other countries were culturally too weak to sort of counterattack and fight back bitterly the way the Iranians did. Now, the Arabs, during the Golden Era, meaning when they ruled everything and shoved down everybody else's throat, and I'm using the Arabs in the very widest sense of the term, because they'll call Arabs anybody who spoke Arabic and participated in the Arab culture. Usually it was Muslims, but there were very important Arab Christian groups who did very important cultural things among them. The Arabs created a glorious civilization. We know, you can't deny it. Sciences, math, arithmetic, as we call it, the Arab numbers, algebra, maybe you've heard of, and astronomy, and geography and history, and all kinds of things happened very often by non-Muslim Arabs. That is, they usually Christian and Jews who spoke Arabic, different part of the Arab culture, which is interesting. But there are a lot of Muslims that did also. I don't want to discriminate over here. And if you're an Arab living today, whether in the West Bank or in Syria or in Egypt, and all, especially if you're an intellectual, you have any kind of culture to you, you know all about this stuff. And this was gewaldig, and everything was going great in those days. The Arabs, especially the Arab Arabs, could not help but view themselves as a master race. Because that's what they did. They conquered such a huge area, and as I just pointed out, they imposed their stuff on everybody else, not the other way around. So don't think the Arabs have a self-image the way Americans often think of Arabs, which is a third world group, and they're behind, and they're backwards, and all the rest. That's not their self-image. It's one of which we are the glorious ones, and at least in the time of our forefathers, we kicked everybody else. And we showed thereby our superiority, and therefore everything about us is glorious. So, for example, the Arabs in the Middle Ages threw a great deal of interest in the study of the Arabic language, grammar, poetry, before anybody else did in their own cultures. Why? Because the Arab language is so self-evidently beautiful that it repays luxuriantly the closest study. So they invented dikduk. The Jews were copying off of them. They invented poetry in the sense that we understand it today, and the Jews were copying off of them. Here's Al-Kharizi, the famous Jewish poet, my favorite, from the time of the Rambam, basically, who has a very famous poem in his book, who was a master of Arabic and also master of Hebrew. I spoke about Mishol a couple months ago, my mother's yahrzeit. He was a master of all the languages, and in fact does amazing things in translations. For those of you here from the yeshiva world, he's the one who did the first translation of the Moreh Nevuchim, and he's the one, when you open the Gemara, he's in the Vilna Shas, He's the one who translated the Pirush Mishnah, the Rambam was Roim, and Brachos and that sort of thing. Better translation, worse translation, but nevertheless. And he has a very famous poem that he starts the book with, which I don't remember exactly, but the point of it is, there's this girl, and some represent the Arabs, and they're saying, we're the most beautiful, and this girl who represents the Hebrew language say, no, I'm the most beautiful, and I'm the one that should get the most attention. And he's simply trying, as a Jew, and a Jewish Jew, to compete, or, culturally compete in an Arab world in which everything else is the Arab language. So this is the world of the Middle Ages. The lower groups, the Jews, the Christians, were actually cultural enzymes. They produced a lot of translations and new innovative ideas in science and technology that the other Arabs were able to use and expand upon, sort of the way the Japanese have done with American technology. You see? Now, as I said, they didn't get everywhere, weren't perfect. Okay, let's do the next one. The places like Persia, threw them out. But nevertheless, they were there for a while. Okay, now the story gets very interesting. As often happens, in fact, maybe always, empires have a tendency to spread until they overextend. Most Americans would agree we did that in the 20th century. That's why we're broke. We went too far. Looking back, shouldn't have gone to Vietnam, shouldn't have gone to Iraq, shouldn't have gone to this. We spent a wealth of money and got nothing out of it. That attitude. Overdid it. Right? Now that when I was growing up, they used to teach you in the high school books, the isolationists before and after war were all crazy. Now, they make a comeback. A lot of people say, they should have listened to Taft and the others. America wouldn't have, gone overseas, lost all the money. We'd be better off today. There's the idea of overstretch. In the case of the Arabs, they couldn't help but keep fighting until they ran into overstretch. That's here, where I'm pointing right now. East of Iran. The stands, this is as far as they got. Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some of the other Turkestan. And the reason I'm saying that is that as they moved east, they ran into not small, easy countries to knock off like Egypt proved to be, or Syria, but vast areas which I just tried to describe, you fought back. And what happened is that they did conquer them, but they found themselves, a small group of Arabs, running a gigantic group of Persians, Turks especially, and all these type of people, what we call today Afghanistanians and Pakistanians and all the rest, and Pathans, Pashtun. There's a lot of people. And for a while, the lady was riding the tiger. But after a while, like in the famous limerick, the smile is on the face of the tiger. All right? And so at first, the Iranians and the Turks and these other far eastern areas served the Arabs. But over time, and not a long time either, the Turks, who were these, let's go back one. The Turks who were up here in these areas, the Muslims were kind of amazing. They had battles in the middle of Russia, the Arabs did. They went very far. But after a while, the way things developed, these Turks who were a conquered group and were Islamized, forced to take the Muslim religion, emerged as the military caste within the Arab state. And the Arabs become the civilian caste, and we all know what that means. Right? So already from the time of the Caliph al-Mutasim, which is in the early 800s, that's a very early one in Arabic history. Muhammad died in 632, and this guy's around literally 200 years later, 832. By the time you get to this Caliph who runs out of Baghdad, because he had a machlokas with his brothers who should take over, and this and that and the other, he formed a special elite military unit of 4,000 Turks. And in his time, he ran them. But after his time, they ran him. Right? His children. And the Arabs lost the military edge. The Turks were wild and crazy fighters. Especially were highly disciplined. And consequently, what happens is that already in the late 800s, people don't know this, the Arabs were no longer the ruling class. The Turks emerged as the ruling class, different types of Turks within the Arab Empire. So it is that huge empire we saw before, but who's calling the shots? You see? And if you're an Arab, you know this. So already, well over 1,000 years ago, they lost it. Now, a Westerner doesn't see this because you say like this, well, it's all Muslim still, and they all talk funny languages, so what's the difference? But it's not true. You understand? This foreign group, so to speak, who were not Arabs at all, and who were sort of like imported from the conquered areas, at least they thought they conquered them, from the far reaches of, by that time, of Afghanistan and Russia and the stands that we call today, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, all this stuff. They are the bosses. And for the next 1,000 years, that's a long time, the Arabs will be the ruled and not the rulers. It's quite a statement I just made. And the average person doesn't know this, even though it's basic history. The Arabs are the ruled and not the rulers. So they haven't really been in charge of anything, right? They haven't had an empire run by them since the 9th century, which is a long time. Now, the people who were the real bosses did subscribe to Islam, and many of them did speak Arabic, many didn't. And they will respect the Quran being in Arab language and all that kind of business. And the Arabs will, within the ruled areas, totally pursue their culture, but they're not the bosses anymore. That was in the 600s to 700s and early 800s. It was the Turks, for example, and the Kurds who fought the Crusaders. Many people don't know that. You think it's the Arabs. The Arabs were nothing by this time. Saladin was a Kurd. All right? I don't know if you know. Yeah, he was from Kurdistan, the Ayyubid dynasty. And that's because when they wanted to have somebody, or if they emerged out of the Islamic world, somebody with a military skill and strength to fight the Crusaders, it ain't going to come from the wimpy Arabs. It's going to come from the manly and martial, Kurds and Turks and that sort of thing. And this is how it goes. Now, these people are Muslims, but they're not Arab. They speak a different language. And as time went on, they no longer regarded the Arabs as culturally superior, which is very much of a diss to the Arabs. By the 1500s, by the time you get to the end of the Middle Ages, the whole of Islam is ruled by two non-Arab peoples, the Persians and the Turks. Right? Isn't that interesting? Here are the two big rulers of the 16th century in Islam. Suleiman the Magnificent, who was a very powerful Turkish ruler, and here's Shah Abbas the first, who was very bad to the Jews, by the way. This guy was good to the Jews. This guy was bad to the Jews. But aside from that, that's the Guns of the Middle East. The Turks had what we would call today, well, let's take a look at the next map. The whole of the Arab world is subsumed. Here's the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and here's the Persian Empire at its maximum. So that's everything. That's the whole Arab map I showed you before. He's not an Arab, the ruler over here. He's a Turkey. He could speak Arabic because he was educated, but he reads the Quran, for example, in Turkish. And the language of administration is Turkish. The poetry, by the way, Suleiman was a big poet. He says the law, the administration, the culture, the poetry, the literature, Turkish. Not to you and I mean, but to them it does. And they were conquerors. I want to show you something. Suleiman the Magnificent not only conquered Budapest, he got up to Vienna. Look at that. That's quite amazing. The Ottomans in their day were something, and so were the Persians. The Persians fought them off. They used to have battles constantly for centuries. The 1500s, the 1600s, and up to half of the 1700s. Who should control Iraq? So, should the Persians control it, as they did in the time of the Gemara, or should the Turks, the Western rulers, control it, as was the time of the Romans? And eventually, went back and forth. Eventually, the Turks won out after 2.5 centuries of fighting. And Iraq, therefore, is an Arab country that speaks Arabic and not a Persian country that speaks Persian. But you can be darn sure you'll understand what I'm saying today. If you're the rulers today of Iran, you want to make things right again. So their goal is to annex Iraq, which has a lot of Shiites anyway, and restore the way it should be. You follow? And so it's kind of interesting. Now, my point is that the Arabs don't play a role in this at the top level of power. They just live there. But the people with the power are either Persians or Turks. So it's actually very culturally insulting. The Ottoman big shots were not Arabs usually. The Turkish Empire was run primarily, Turkish Empire, believe it or not, by people from here. Almost all the grand viziers and big shots were from Christian origins and from Islamized family. You understand? Greek, Albanian, Bulgarian, Yugoslavian, Serbians. It's quite remarkable. All the guys who became the pashas and the big vizier, Mehmet Sakalo and all these guys, You look, who are they? Oh, either he himself was actually born as a Christian. I mean, just to give you an example, I don't want to bore you. Suleiman the Magnificent was this powerful Turkish ruler. His prime minister was Pargali Ibrahim Pasha, who was, I think, Greek, and just converted as a child. And no, I want to tell you. And he became the head of the whole Turkish Empire. And then he brought his parents, who were still Christians, and he built them a nice big house in Istanbul. And he not exactly, but like Yosef, say, I'm taking care of my family now, even though he himself stayed Muslim because, of course, he's now part of the Turkish Empire. Where do the Arabs play a role in any of the stuff I just mentioned? They don't. You see? The Arabs are people effete, as they would see being seen by the Turkish, into religion, old times, poetry, literature, but, and they come they serve in the army also, but the real men are Turks, you understand? Or Balkanized groups who were conquered by the Turks. Real men are Albanians, it's Bulgarians, like we would call today Yugoslavians, Serbians, and things like that. That's where the action is. So that's quite remarkable. Now, why did the Arabs revolt against this? First of all, you don't revolt against the Turks, right? First they kill you, and then you have the trial. But second of all, they don't fool around over there. No, but it's also true. No, hold on. Look at this map, right? Look at this map. The Turks justified their power by conquering a third of Europe. The old Arabs, when they ruled the empire, right, when the Arabs were in charge, they never got past here. You get it? They never got into Turkey. In the 600s, the 700s, the 800s, and even afterwards, the 9 and 1000s, they were always stopped here by the Byzantine Empire, as they call it. And this was the limit of the Arab Empire. Look what the Turks did. They took over the whole Ganze Byzantine Empire. And they Islamized it. I mean, they ruled Budapest, you understand? They in the Battle of Mohacs, they conquered the whole Hungary, and they took over Budapest was a Turkish town. And so the feeling was, God is obviously justifying them if they're carrying the banner of Islam to places where nobody else was able to do before. So they must be the ones, they're entitled to be the caliphs, and they were the caliphs of Islam. So once again, is it a Muslim thing? Is it a ethnic thing? Now, problem is that then eventually the Europeans start to get stronger. And they start causing the Turks to lose ground. And then that success, which is the theological justification for the Turks being the rulers of the Arabs, starts to erode. You get to the great era when, Sobieski, the king of Poland, beats the Turks away from Vienna, and Prince Eugene of Savoy conquers Hungary, and General Suvorov of Catherine the Great conquers the Crimea and the southern Ukraine and those areas, and the Turks are on the losing side. From now on, they never win a war. Not really. They always question of how much did they lose or how little. That means that the Muslim, they're losing faith. I mean, look what they had earlier, and then look over here. They're losing this, and they're losing over there. It's starting to erode in the 1700s. The loss of Hungary was a big sign that they're going to lose a lot. Here, you don't appreciate it, but look at all this territory over here, and the Russians got it. You understand? This area over here was the Hungarian part, and the Habsburgs got it. And it's the beginning of a long phase that goes on for 200 years. Then comes the shock of Napoleon. In 1799, Napoleon landed an army in Egypt, and 1, 2, 3 wiped out a bunch of Turkish armies, which already showed everybody that a good European army, led by a Napoleon-type guy, could easily conquer the Ottoman Empire. Right? So this state, which had been so powerful, all of a sudden is naked. The emperor has no clothes. It's very clear that if the British wouldn't bother him, Napoleon could take over the Turkish Empire. And if Napoleon could do it, so if nobody will bother the Russians could conquer the Ottoman Empire. Or the French, well, I just said that, or some other European state like that. The only thing is, none of the European states trust each other, and so the British will block the Russians from taking over, and the Russians will block the British and the French from taking over, and welcome to the politics of the 19th century, what they used to call the Great Game, which is who takes over the Middle East. So what I'm trying to show you is that they lost a lot of faith with the Arabs. Because, why are you ruling us? You're not efficiently carrying forth the Islam banner anymore. By the 1800s, they're really losing a lot of ground. Look at this. Here's what it was, and they lost everything in Europe. By 1914, they lost everything in Europe. They're left to what they have today. And instead of all this business, you see the picture. And so if you're an Arab, you interpret the loss that's constantly being suffered by the Ottoman Empire as a sign, either from God or from politics. Maybe the Arabs should have a Tchias HaMesim as a powerful group. In the process, therefore, the Ottoman sultans lose the fear and the respect of the Arabs and their legitimacy. Okay, now, what are the results of this? And incidentally, this is all going to happen at the same time that another group called Zionism is starting. You follow? This is the problem. Two totally separate operations. The Jewish nationalism in its original nascent form will also start around the 1830s and 40s, and then will pick up steam, and it won't crystallize until the 1890s. But nevertheless, you have two groups coming out of completely different contexts that are starting to think of, what about us asserting our nationalism? Two movements will develop in the Middle East in the second half of the 1800s. First, a Muslim movement to warily reevaluate Western culture without admitting the inferiority of Islam. And so here you have two people that no one's ever heard of, unless you're a Muslim, who already in the 1800s are starting to say, listen, the Europeans are getting so far ahead of us, the Christians are getting so far ahead of us. Of course, the Europeans and the Christians are dogs and dirt, all the rest of it, but they're getting ahead of us. And so our attitude of burying our head in the sand and not being interested in what's going on outside the world of Islam and not too productive, maybe we should start to copy some of the stuff from the West, provided we do it in the right way. We want to be modern Orthodox. We don't want, God forbid, be Reform, So, no, I'm serious. And, you can imagine there was a right-wing reaction against them and the left-wingers and so forth, but they have to catch up, otherwise the Europeans are going to just totally take them over. So there's one movement that starts in the Middle East, and that's a movement to try to Westernize to a degree. As you can see, these guys are pretty frum, but they are nevertheless they want to Westernize to a degree. Secondly, alongside of that, a distinctly Arab movement began among Arab intellectuals. They figured, look, the Ottoman Turks have screwed things up. The Arabs should have been kept low by the Ottoman Turks. The Arabs, if you define them as Arab speakers, which is controversial, but nevertheless, ought to now shake off the Turkish domination, form an Arab state, and usher in a new golden age, which had, after all, been rudely interrupted by the uncivilized Turks 1,000 years before. And here's a group of this Arab Zionism, get it? These are early, same time as Theodor Herzl. I mean it. They're saying to Theodor Herzl, totally on their own, they're saying there should be an Arab nationalist movement. Now, most people aren't aware of the fact. They say, well, you were in the Arabs already. No, the Arabs lost their Arab stuff back in the 800s, you see? And they say, we want to cop it back and stop the clear decline of the Muslim world and of the Arab world and revive the glorious picture we had in the 600s and the 700s and the early 800s. Now, in other words, as I just pointed out before, the nascent secular Arab nationalist movement began at the same time as the Jewish movement, meaning at the same time as the Chovevei Tzion and the Zionist movement. Right? Here's the early form of Zionism, the Chovevei Tzion, and of course Herzl then took it to another place. Actually, they even look alike. Don't they? And they're all, by the way, they're both operating at the same time. Neither one knows about the other, or if they do, they don't care. You understand? And so anyhow, the early years of the 20th century, complicate things even more, if that's possible. In response to the loss of their European possessions, and the Turks were kicked out of all Europe eventually, in the Balkan Wars that took place just before the First World War, they, mamish, got up to, they threw the Turks out of everything, out of Bulgaria, the lands that have been ruled by them for centuries. So what do you do now? You have a Turkish empire with nothing in Europe, which is where they used to get all their ministers and smart people. And now all the Turks rule is a Muslim area. In response to the loss of the European possessions, Ottoman Turkish nationalists seize power from the Sultan and rules the Young Turks. Meaning in 1909 there was a revolution in which the Sultan who ruled Turkey one after the other for many centuries was not exactly deposed, but was made a figurehead, and instead a bunch of nationalist officers and intellectual types, they seized power. Now, by the way, if you're an Arab today, we go on the websites, they'll say this was a Jewish plot. Yeah, well, because in other words, it eventually leads to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire and to the rise of Zionism. So post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? In other words, if this undid the Ottoman Empire, next thing you know, you get the Balfour Declaration. Obviously, this was a Zionist plot, and I know you laugh when you say it. It's amusing to me that everybody laughs because you're in a tiny minority. If you go online, TV shows and miniseries in the Arabic world, in the Arabic language, talk about this all the time, and it's like obvious to them. And, they would consider you to be just, ignorant beyond belief. These young Turks push what they hope is a centripetal Ottoman nationalism opposed to an Arab nationalism. So they say like this: we have to create now a patriotism of the Turkish Empire. The Turks are only one group and there's all these others. Everybody has to get with the program, right? Everybody has to get to be a Turkish patriot. You understand? And whoever doesn't do that is no good. But if you do that, if you say, I'll learn Turkish and I'll be very patriotic to the Sultan and I'll try to work for the greater glory of Turkey and all that kind of business and the Turkish Empire, then you'll be favored. Now, the Ottoman government therefore views the Arab nationalists as negative, as centrifugal, pulling apart. And so they hang them. Right? So it's kind of funny. The bitterest enemy, this is the irony of history. In the first part of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1914, the bitterest enemies of the Jews in Palestine get hanged by the Turks. You know what I'm saying? The intellectuals who start, the Arab intellectuals who start newspapers and say, don't sell to the Jews, they're trying to Karen Kayemet as a big plot to take over the country, and our number one foe is the nascent Zionist movement, all the rest of it. They get hanged by the Turks because they're not getting with the Turkish program. You understand? The Jews didn't tell them to do it, but they hang them, in fact, they used to hang them at Shar Yafo. I couldn't just find a picture of it. But, that's how it works over there. So, as I said, this actually helped the Jews because they were thinking, how can we go with the Turkish program to get the Turks to like us to facilitate Zionism? This is Ben Gurion. Right? He went for a year or two to Istanbul. He never went to school in his life. Let's get that straight. Ben Gurion never went to school. There's a lesson in there, but he never went to school. Wait a minute. No, I'm wrong. He went for a year or maybe more to take courses in the university in Istanbul. And he did speak Turkish, by the way. Right? It's Ben Gurion spoke English, sort of. He spoke Ivrit and Yiddish, and maybe another language, and Turkish. Now, he could curse in Russian, but but that's true of many. Now, wait a second. His idea was, as you know, he's a total Zionist. His is learn Turkish, learn the Turkish thing, and then, armed with that knowledge, use it to make contacts with the Turkish administration in Palestine and help facilitate the Jewish cause. You understand? So don't be surprised at this. Now, then came World War I, and in World War I, listen closely, the Turks were very brutal to the Arabs. Here's the Turkish general Jamal Pasha, who kicked a bunch of Jews out, but he killed by the thousands and tens of thousands Arabs. I'll say it again. He's a Turk, and the Arabs are his citizens, and they're all Muslims, and he didn't fool around. So the British, who are fighting the Turks, naturally said like this: divide and impera, divide and conquer, why not? And so the British, if they're fighting them, the British will talk to the leader of the Arabs in Arabia, it's what we call today Saudi Arabia, which at that time there was not Saudi Arabia, it was just Arabia, in Mecca and Medina, as Sharif Hussein. All right? And they say like this: hook up with the British, with us, and fight the Turks, and it'll be good for both sides. And he's old, so he sends his son Faisal to fight with Lawrence of Arabia. This is who Lawrence of Arabia is. The British officer that was sent to fight with the Arabs against the Turks. It's funny, right? They're getting one group of Muslims to fight the others. The British, of course, very much wanted this because they didn't want. Let me put it this way: when Turkey declared war on England in 1914, they also declared a jihad because the Sultan of Turkey happens to be the Caliph of Islam, and he therefore has the religious authority from the halachic point of view of Islam to declare the British to be objects of a holy war. And there were hundreds of millions of Muslims in the British Empire. I'll give you just one example. India and Pakistan. Hundreds of millions. And the Turkish and German plan was that they should make a big uprising, which could have happened, and checked the British. And they were scared to death of this in India, believe me. And there are many famous novels and books from that time about this, the Richard Hannay stories. And the British say, well, no, we'll have a good counter against that, because the guy who's the ruler of Mecca Medina, which is Sharif Hussein, he'll join the British. So that'll counter the jihad thing. So look how all this business is playing chess, right? Everybody's playing chess. Now, the British basically promised the Hashemite family, that's what it is, from Hashem, and through them the Arab peoples, that if they helped the British win the war, a great Arab state, you hear what I said? An Arab state. Not a Muslim state, we already had that, thank you. When an Arab state will be created by the victor for the first time in 1,000 years. The British promised that they'll make this an Arab country. You see how big it is, right? So it's all today, Israel and Syria and Iraq and all that kind of business. And you Arabs haven't had a country for 1,000 years, right? So it's a good deal. Now, it doesn't happen. Because when the First World War is over, the British basically shafted the Arabs, the British and the French. First you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then you have, this is, does it work? Here's the Versailles Treaty, the conference at Versailles. Here's FAISAL with the British officer and Lloyd George. And Lloyd George is giving them the bad news, you know. And here's, this is Balfour, right here. And he's got the message. He says, well, Palestine's actually going to the Jews, you know. You get it? And here's Woodrow Wilson, who's going to be a hypocrite to the Arabs because he promised us that you have self-determination and since the Arabs are majority in the Middle East, so you should make an Arab country. And Woodrow Wilson is not going to go along with that. And so if you're an Arab, you see the Treaty of Versailles as a huge betrayal. If you're the ISIS or the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, I mean, you know this very well, and you teach this to your children even today. So this is a betrayal not of Islam, it is, but it's a betrayal of Arabs. Get it? You promised us we'll have one big Arab country, and we can go back to having a golden culture and a good old civilization like we had once before. But it doesn't happen. Instead of an Arab state, they get a bunch of states whose borders were invented by the British and the French, and even these are not independent states. So the British and the French create Syria, they create Palestine. Later, of course, we know they subdivide Palestine into Jewish and Arab. Then they create Iraq. What's left? The Arabia is left. No. The Hashemite family gets kicked out of Arabia by the Saudis, if you can follow that. And so everything is all samished. And what happened to all the promises? Now remember, throughout their history, the Arabs had never been ruled by Europeans, by Christians, who they regard as their inferiors. You followed the story with me, hopefully, today. I told you a story from the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1800s. Never during those times were the Arabs ruled by people who were Christians or by Europeans. What happened was the Arabs started ruling themselves, and then they're ruled by Turks of various types, and maybe Persians. No, they're only ruled by Muslims, so that's bad enough, but now, in the 20th century, they get ruled by Christians. You understand how problematic this is for Arabs? Like, we're not an inferior race. We're not a colonial power. This is not Africa or India. That's what they say. Do you understand? We are a proud people that have a better civilization than you. We're not inferior to Europe. We're superior to Europe. So it was very shocking and disturbing to them, and still is, that in the latest period of history, the worst thing in their mind should ever happen, which is that they should be taken over by Christians. Educated Arabs in the various states respond by developing a modern concept of Arab nationalism, that wherever Arab is spoken is one big country. So go back to that map for a minute ago, before this. I mean, these are really different peoples. But say, oh, no, the theory of Arab nationalism, if you talk the same language, it's all one country. So a similar idea would be America and Canada and South Africa and Britain and all this should be one country, because they all speak English. You understand? And other countries around the world like that, Ireland should be all part of one country, because they speak English, you see, of a sort. So, wait a second. We wouldn't agree to that, but the Arab nationalists insist on it. So it's a question of where you put your emphasis on. Is it where the language is spoken, that's kovei everything? Or do you say, no, language is interesting, but nationalism and ethnicity is more kovei? And it becomes a question of this kind of business. Now, this had never existed in the past, when there was a great caliphate which ruled over a polyglot empire. Meaning there never was such a thing that all the Arabs got together in a state. What happened was the Arabs conquered and shoved down the throats of everybody in the 600s and 700s. The Arab language and culture and religion. And the people didn't like it. I told you the Persians were strong enough to kick them out, the others weren't. But there never was ever in history such a thing as an Arab country of a large area. But why spoil the beauty of history with facts? The desire for a great state, well, I'll tell you, all nationalism, listen to this closely, all nationalism cannot help but be based to some degree or another on myth. Some nationalisms have a bigger amount of myth, and some have a lesser amount of myth. Here we're talking 90-10, but what the heck? Now, the desire for a single great state is frustrated by these European drawn borders. So if you're an Arab nationalist, and this is particularly true in the 20th century, today things are different, it bothers you a lot that Syria and Iraq are two separate countries. That was a fiendish plot on the part of the Europeans to divide them and to fight each other and waste their energy on stupid quarrels when really we should be one. You know, to use a Jewish example, Elef Aleph Alfei Havdalas, but you can't, cannot help but notice this similarity, even though it's vastly different. Look at the Haftorah today, right? He says there's a constant battle between Judah and Israel, between the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. And the Navi is saying like this: no, Hashem says the Eitz Yehuda and the Eitz Yosef should get together. What are we fighting each other for, right? You follow? So I guess it's a different story, but you see the parallel that I'm talking about over here. Anyways, I said the desire for a single great state is frustrated by the European drawn borders, which cannot help but develop local patriotisms. So in other words, the British, cleverly or not cleverly, let's go to the next one. I mean, this guy doesn't ask the British, he just sets up his own kingdom. They give him what we call today Jordan. The British just decided they owed him something from fighting in the First World War, so they gave him a country called Jordan. It's a nice deal. And they gave him, who was his brother, the two brothers, Abdul and Faisal, they gave him, as a reward for fighting with the British, a country called Iraq, which they invented. No, they invented Jordan, and they invented Iraq. So why aren't Jordan and Iraq one big country at least? It's totally because the British decided, you don't want two, you have to give, what should I say, you have to give presents to both brothers. You know the story of a little kid that, he's always eating them for himself, so he said, why don't you share something with your two brothers? So he gives them one potato, so he breaks them into two, He gives it to the two of them. He didn't give them anything more. So that's how the Arabs look at what the British did over here. Then, in addition to this, there's the problem of Egypt, which I haven't mentioned, because Egypt is an actual country. There has never been in history, think about what I'm about to tell you, there has never been in history a country called Iraq before the British invented it. There has never been in history, this is really interesting what I'm about to say, there has never been in history a country called Syria. Isn't that interesting? There were kingdoms in Syria that fought each other. There's never been a country called Syria. There's Aram Naharaim, there's Aram Damascus, Aram Sova. If you know your Tanakh, you'll remember when David HaMelech beat this Aram, the other Aram joined him, and saluted him. There has never been in history a country called Jordan. But my friends, there has been in history a country called Egypt. You see my point? They have a long national tradition, even though Egypt wasn't an independent country since Alexander the Great's time, or since Julius Caesar's time to be more exact. They've never been an independent country. But before that, as we all know, the pharaohs were around before Avram Avinu. And so they're a real country. And if that's the case, are they Arabs? Now the Arabs conquered them, and they Arabized them, and they shoved the Arabic language down their throat. But look at this. Here's one of the most important Egyptian intellectuals of the 20th century, blind. And became a Nobel Prize, a very important person. And what does he say? Intellectual in the Egyptian Renaissance? As he says over here, Egyptian civilization diametrically opposed to Arabic civilization. Egypt will only progress by reclaiming its pre-Islamic roots. See, he wants to go back to Paro, okay? No, but I want to tell you something. Now, by the way, the Frum Muslims in Egypt are very angry at this and so forth, but he represents a very strong current in educated Egyptians in the 20th century, and he wasn't the only one. Now, unfortunately, it didn't pan out this way. Israel, at the time of Theodor Herzl, at the time of Chaim Weizmann, until the 1930s, there were Zionist movements that were very active in Egypt. In Egypt, I repeat, there were 70,000 Jews. Maybe some of you read recently the new biographies of Ovadia Yosef since he passed away. So now they come on. You see what a big life there was in Egypt, even though he had a hard time over there. The Jews did well economically, all the rest of it, and it didn't exactly identify itself with the Arabic culture. Now it came to. It happened eventually, but in the past, and even to some degree in the present, there's a strong idea that we talk the same language as the Arabs because they shoved it down our throats, but we're not Arabs. We're vastly superior to the Arabs, and we should have nothing to do with them. They'll just drag us down. So in the interwar years, in the 20s and the 30s, a hothouse environment is created in which Arab intellectuals are in a fervor. Arab intellectuals in Lebanon, and Syria, and Iraq, and Egypt, and all these other places. One thing is clear: there is no room for a Jewish state in the heart of all this in the Arab world. The Arab Christians and other minorities sort of blend naturally into the Arabic nationalism simply because it's secular. So if you're a Christian and you live in Syria, you want to be a big Syrian patriot, because if you don't talk about Syria, then it'll be the ISIS, you know what I mean? Then it'll be religious, and then you'll be a dhimmi, a second-class citizen. But if you create a secular state, then there'll be equality, hopefully at least at the legal level, and that'll be better for you. So the Arabic Christians are among the most violent and strong nationalists and anti-Israel. Oh my goodness. Even though you and I know today, if Israel goes down, they lose also, but they don't see it that way. Jews, by the way, would have done so if not for the rise of Zionism. Get it? Simply because of smart politics. If Jews in Iraq, in Syria, and places like that, had there not been an Israel movement, so to get along, and you lived in Egypt, wherever in the 20th century, go with the Arab nationalism. Why not? I mean, that'll be good for you too. In 1934, Ben Gurion, who was the head of the Zionist movement at that time, holds talks with Syrian Arab political intellectuals. He wrote a whole book on it, My Conversation with Arab Leaders, which he published in 1967. Now, these are unproductive. Here's Ben Gurion at that time. Here's Musa Alami, who was a big Palestinian macher. He was the secretary of the High Commissioner in the British. He was a highly educated guy. And he, is the Shadchan. He has meetings. He arranges meetings for Ben Gurion to go to Syria and talk with this big macher and this Lebanese guy and all the rest of it. It's not like he didn't know what's going on. But Ben Gurion imagined maybe can come to some kind of modus vivendi, agree to you help us get a Jewish state, we'll get an Arab state, and the Arab state, no, we don't want a Jewish state, we just want an Arab state, thank you very much. By World War II, it's clear that British and French colonialism is not going to last too much longer. France was defeated by the Germans, as you all know, and they emerged very weak. And Britain blew all their money and resources fighting World War II. And Arab intellectuals and political thinkers already start dreaming of an Arab third way. Here's three very important intellectuals, one a Muslim, one a Christian, and one a Druze. He's Druze, he's a Sunni Muslim, and he is a Christian. And they create the Ba'ath Party, which means that they want to, So they say like this, fascism isn't a good match, communism is not a good match, democracy is not a good match for the Arabs. What's left? Socialism is not a good match for the Arabs. Arab Zah, right? We want our own Arab Zionism, if I can use that term. It should be part socialism, part not socialism, part democracy, part not democracy, part fascism. We want to make our own cholent, which will work for us. And this will be the magic formula for secular Arab nationalism, which will, first of all, win us our independence and then catapult us to the top of the world, because they're intellectuals, so they live in a dream world, And it's very utopian. I mean, you see the writings, it's very utopian, and it appeals to the Arabs. After the war, the Arabs do gain independence, but they don't get it all at once. They get it one by one, state by state. Syria became independent in 1945, and then Lebanon, and Jordan didn't get rid of the British until about 4 or 5 years later. Iraq, a couple years after that. It doesn't happen. Egypt had a bitter struggle with the British. They only got rid of them in 53, 54, when Nasser came in. It didn't happen overnight. And since it didn't happen overnight, so it wasn't possible for all the Arab states to get together in one state. Because each state went in on its own, and as soon as they come on its own, local patriotisms get involved. And if this guy's taking over Syria, then he doesn't want anybody else. And you don't want to lose his job to somebody else. And next thing you know, you have a bunch of Arab states who were actually against each other as much as four. Each one jealously guards its sovereignty. But the Arabs are free. By the time you get to the 50s, the Europeans are gone. It's a euphoria. Everything's going to be great. No. Because the reality kicks in. You get tremendous poverty and tremendous political dysfunction. And worst of all, as we all know, right in the middle of what should be a glorious era, when the Arabs finally, after 1,000 years, finally get their independence, Israel. Right? No, that wasn't part of the... Nobody foresaw that. Okay? And the birth of Israel happens at the dawn of modern Arab nationalism. Now, again, I'm spending tonight trying to show you how the world looks from their glasses. Right? But these are our neighbors. So they see it the way I'm describing you. Israel happened at the wrong time. Make sure you get that. It doesn't fit in. You understand? It's not the way it was supposed to go. The way it was supposed to go is we had a period of European colonialism, finally got rid of them, we got our own thing, and we'll try to fix it, our own problems. This is the first time in Arab history that they lost Arab territory. Okay? They didn't have Persia really, so it's not Arab. But Arab, as far as Arab-speaking lands, the Turks were ruling them for hundreds of years, and before them were the other types of Turks, and the Mamluks, and this and that and the other. They were, understand closely what I'm saying. They were ruled by foreigners, even the British, if you want to look at it that way, or the French. But they never took their karka from them. The Jews didn't rule Israel. They kicked the Arabs out, one way or another. Or that's the way the story ended. They actually took their stuff away from them. So the Arabs, they lost land. You follow? They didn't lose land under the Turks. They didn't lose land under the British and the French. They didn't lose land when they were ruled by some other empire, right? They were just ruled by somebody, but they're there when it's over. Here they lose it in a permanent way. So this is really very insulting them. We Arabs, we don't lose land. That's not what we do. It's never happened in our history. And to the Jews, those scumbags, right? If people made fun of the Arabs, can you imagine how much the Arabs historically made fun of the Jews? Because the Arabs were always a master and conquering race. And the Jews, because they lived among the Arabs, had to always be very nebuchi. No, I mean it. You had to turn the other cheek. In Arab country, if an Arab insults a Jew, you got to take it, you got to turn the other cheek, or they'll kill you. You understand? And they beat you up, and so on and so forth. And because the Jews have to live that kind of existence, they have lost for 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, any kind of respect from Arab culture. The Jews always less and less. I think I mentioned before, but I'll mention it again. I saw a historian who was writing about the 1500s, or 1600s, talking about a Jew wanted to convert to Islam, and the Muslim guy said, "We don't take Islam is a high class club. We don't take a Jew. No, that's what he told him. Go and convert to Christian, and then a month later convert to us." No. But what does that tell you in terms of cultural messages? And now these guys have set up a state, and they've taken our land away and kicked our people out. We're the great ones. They're the inferior ones. How did that happen? And so what happens when the irresistible force of a movable object? You understand? What happens when your ideology runs into scientific facts? It's a real problem. This is why the Arabs view Zionism as something particularly fiendish. Right? Napoleon came and left. Allenby came and left the British. He didn't leave. Right? The Jews stayed. They set up their own country. They kicked them out. You understand? And the Arabs that are there are held in bondage. So what's going on? It's a real problem. Now, in the 50s, as we get to where we are, Nasser comes to power in 1952, 1954, and he's the apotheosis of Arab nationalism. It doesn't get better than that. First of all, he's from Egypt. So if he identifies with Arab nationalism, it means that Egypt is signing on the team. Right? He's not Taha Hussein, who says the Arabs are, like I say, sand jockeys, would have nothing to do with them. Egypt is higher class than that. We just have a same language. Any more than a Britisher is going to say we're like Irish. You understand? It's not going to happen. Right? Nasser isn't like that. He writes his famous book, or his friend writes the book for him, called The Philosophy of the Revolution, in which he says Egypt is an African country, and Egypt is an Egyptian country, and Egypt is an Arab country. But Egypt is Egypt. It's always number one. So if it's an African country, it's the number one country of all the Africans. If it's an Arab country, it's no one cabinet. And Egypt, of course, we're number one because in Egypt, no, we've been around since Paro and all that sort of thing, So and by the way, he speaks this way on the radio, and He talks about the glorious Arabs and the glorious past, and we're going to get the glorious present back, and the only people stopping them are fiendish, bad people of all type, of East and West and Jewish and the other. I mean, if you're an Arab, you like to hear this kind of stuff. You get it? And so, to Arabs, Nasser is the face not only of pride, but of progress and reform, which he wishes to make synonymous with Arab nationalism. I told you, he was against slavery, for example, which was still an issue. He's opposed by the very conservative Saudi monarchy. He was the intelligent one. The one before him, King Saud, was stupid, but Faisal was the opposite of stupid. And it was in his time that the constant criticism of Nasser on the radio finally got him to do something he didn't want to do, which is abolish slavery in 1964. People don't know that. Okay? Because America didn't want to say anything about it because the gas was 20 cents. That's what it is. I'll tell you, I told you last week, they still had official slavery. They still do now, but now it's unofficial. But that time it was official slavery. And the official slavery up to 1964 was 90% black and 10% white. That's how it went. But people didn't want to talk about it. You know, they still send slave kidnapping expeditions and all that in the 50s. But Eisenhower didn't want to talk about it. You see? Because the gas at 20 cents. There's what they say in public and what they really do. All right? So this makes Nasser, if anything, the leader of a fraction within the Arab world. And there will emerge in the late 50s and the 60s two camps, pro-Nasser, anti-Nasser. Okay, Israel's got to maneuver within them, but it's pro-Nasser and anti-Nasser. And the leader of the anti-Nasser is Saudi Arabia. The Saudis and their team say, stop talking about Arab nationalism. That's Reform Judaism, right? No, talk about Islam. You understand? They're more into that. Islam is a more effective way to oppose Israel. And he was right. We know this today. He said Israel, as long as you talk about Arab nationalism, Israel could team up with Nigeria or something like that, or Indonesia, because even though they're a Muslim country, but they're not Arabs, and therefore you can talk to them about economic cooperation and things like that. But if you talk about Islam, then you kill any chance for them having any shaykh with Israel. As you know, in our time, this has emerged as a reality. So he actually was right. In the 50s, this wasn't followed, and that was good for Israel. You follow? In the Ben Gurion era, what I just described did not happen yet, and that gave Israel a lot more room to maneuver. It was Nasser was predominating. I can only say this in hindsight. That's what historians do. And in the 50s, they said, "Oh, Nasser's a terrible problem." Looking back, he was better than what came after him. This is like, what the Gemara said, be mispalo for the Shalom Malchus. You don't know what's going to take place afterwards. It's a crazy world. After the Yom Kippur War, when Arab nationalism, after its third or fourth defeat, was discredited, so then Faisal's way will predominate. It'll become very much more Islamic, to Israel's misfortune, and to the misfortune of a country called the United States of America, as you see over here. Right? And to the misfortune, by the way, of the Muslim world. This is the Taliban, these other guys hanging. This happens all the time. Notice these are Muslims killing Muslims. And it's because the Arab national thing was put aside, and now you have the ISIS, and you have the Taliban, you have the Al-Qaeda, and all the others. And they're shooting. I could fill the screen, as you know, with 100 pictures like this and more. And by the way, to the misfortune of the Saudis themselves, because out of this emerged Osama bin Laden and his followers who went over to Saudi Arabia, do they not? So they created their own monster. It was the bad luck of the Arabs that exactly at the same time that their nationalism turned white hot, it was their misfortune that Israel, led by Ben Gurion, whose Jewish nationalism was white hot. That's what makes the 50s so interesting. All right? The essence of the Ben Gurion era was the overwhelming consensus in Israel in favor of an uncompromising Jewish nationalism, the kind that in many respects mirrors the hostility the Arab world feels towards it. You get what I'm saying? It's not the way today. Today you have a strong left, and you have a lot of Jews who are self-critical, and maybe the Arabs are right. Unfortunately, go to the campuses. All the Jewish kids are joining the BZD and worse. Right? It didn't happen in the 50s, and certainly didn't happen in Israel. There basically was hardly a left. The influence of Ben Gurion and the government resources he had at that time dominated the Israeli culture. A very important factor is that prior to 1965, the government owned the news. You get it? The TV and radio. So in Ben Gurion's time, he wasn't stupid. Walter Cronkite worked for me. Right? No, which, by the way, is true in many countries. I'll just give you one example. In France, the government owns the news. You get it? And it's not independent. In England, it's theoretically independent with the BBC, but in France, it's not. And so you're not going to hear strong, fundamental criticism of the regime from French TV or radio. So in Ben-Gurion's time, I'm only mentioning this because, Jews are super hypercritical, and if you would have the news at that time, the radio, and later the TV, going against the government, so that would weaken the national resolve, because that's what happens when you have this kind of free press. You didn't have a free press in that way. Basically, the only paper that ever attacked Ben-Gurion from the left was Haaretz, which has a readership, no question about it, but isn't the dominant force. Most Israelis at that time, like today, get the news from the radio. In the 50s, I told you when they had the rubber ducky incident, every hour in the news junkies, and the radio works for Ben-Gurion. And so, what is the feeling among the overwhelming majority of the masses in Israel in the Ben-Gurion period? Heck with the Arabs. They're a bunch of murderers. They cut our throats. It's a good thing you keep them far away. If they kill one of us, kill 10 of them. It's those kind of feelings. If the Arabs are violent towards Israel, Ben-Gurion is violent towards them, as we've seen. And his spirit inspires Moshe Dayan and the Sharon and all that kind of business. It's an era of public support, overwhelming public support in Israel for very bloody reprisal raids. You understand? When Israel, as I told you last year, blew up this town, Akiba and the others, so the whole world went crazy, and Haaretz went crazy. But everybody else said, good. Hit them twice. Because they're murderers. They come to Kfar Chabad and shoot children. All this kind it is what it is. And so, it's an era of public support for reprisal raids. It's an era of overwhelming public support in Israel for the military government over the Israeli Arabs. In the years I'm talking about, 50s, 57 to 61, the Arabs live under the control of the Israeli army. You understand what I'm saying? If you go up north, which is the majority area of the Arab population in Israel, the Galil, in Akko, and in all the territories in there, if you're Arab, you can't travel outside of your town without a special pass by the government. You can't get a job without a special pass by the government. You can't teach in a school without getting a heter from the Shin Bet. You can't do, I'll talk about this next week. I mean, and it's very non-democratic. Now, they do vote, but the army does look at you how you vote, right? And it's very non-democratic. The overwhelming majority of the Israeli public has no problem with this whatsoever. You get it? Well, you got to keep them there because they'll come and they'll rise the shechta. The overwhelming majority is in favor of the demonization of the Arabs in the Israeli culture and in the Israeli media and all that kind of stuff. The overwhelming majority of the Israeli culture in Ben-Gurion's time is all in favor of no give on the question of borders and on the right of return, right? Which today is a much trickier business. You do not find in any significant group in the Ben-Gurion era, especially when in the late 50s when he was Taka in charge, that people say, oh, let's get back to the part of the Negev in order to get a peace treaty with Egypt and all this kind of stuff, or let's let in as Kennedy and Eisenhower would let 100, 200,000 Arab refugees. No give, thank you, right? You give me, then I'll give you. We'll talk. Till then, you say no, I say no twice. And again, this was Arab propaganda, gets zero traction in Israel. They used to listen to it. They have the Arab TV shows in Hebrew and in Arabic and all this kind of stuff. Now, it gets traction among the Arabs in Israel, but it gets no traction among the Jews. Matter of fact, Ephraim Kishon, the famous humorist, has a famous article, I remember from the late 50s, Ben-Gurion's time. He says, I'm listening to the Syrian show, la 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 la, it's a great song and all the rest. Only afterwards I find, let's kill the Jews twice and three times, Meaning the lyrics were pretty bloody, but it doesn't mean anything to him. Because it's just, of course they're all murderers, and that's naturally they're going to sing. So that's the way it goes. The left in the Ben-Gurion era is emasculated in Israel. You probably know who Martin Buber was. I bet you none of you know who Rabbi Binyamin was. There was a tiny group of intellectuals on what we would call the left who say, no, we should be more forthgiving towards the Arabs. We should be more accommodating in terms of taking in refugees. We are too stark and too harsh, all the rest of it. Yeah, but they wrote for each other. You get it? And Ben-Gurion had no problem with it. Believe me, when Martin Buber came in the room, Ben-Gurion stood up for him and says, you're older than I am. And I mean it. And think of that because he's not going anywhere. You understand? A philosophy professor at the Hebrew University, among Graduate students, if you're part of this group, so then you go to the coffee clutches in Rehavia and places like that, and you talk about how bad Ben Gurion and all the rest of this. But it doesn't mean anything for 99% of the population out there. So basically what I'm trying to say is that Ben Gurion carried out the Jabotinsky policy. Jabotinsky gave a famous speech about the Iron Wall. And he says, listen, if we wait for the Arabs to love us, it'll never happen. Therefore, we have to establish in Israel, if necessary, build an iron wall around it until they get used to us, and then we take the iron wall down. Because even Jabotinsky said, listen, in the end, we want to live in peace with everybody, but we want our own. Right? So if to make a real peace, fine. The difference between me and you, what makes me civilized and makes you uncivilized, is you want to kill me, I don't want to kill you. But if you want to kill me, I want to put up an iron wall. So Ben Gurion was on the left, so to speak, but he carried out, if I can use it, the policies of the right. The political geography of the Ben Gurion era is therefore fascinating and is a key to everything I just said. Ben Gurion, as you know, is the head of the Mapai party. The Mapai is associated with the left. It's a socialist party. Mifleget Poalei Eretz Yisrael. Right? It's associated with socialism, but really it's the party of the center. Right? In his time, they occupied the center of the spectrum. The Mapai under Ben Gurion's time, pretty doggone nationalistic. It is Poalei Eretz Yisrael, but the primacy is on Eretz Yisrael. Poalei is secondary. You understand? That is the essence of its difference between the Mapai and the parties to the left of Mapai. The Mapam, for example. So Mapai is Poalei Eretz Yisrael. Mapam is Mifleget Poalei Muchered. There's no mention of Eretz Yisrael. It's all about the workers and socialism. And so if you're to the Mapai, you say, I'm in favor of socialism, but only if it helps the Jewish, only such a way it helps the Jewish nationalism. So what I'm trying to show you is the socialist world is dominated by the Mapai party, who used to get 40, 45 seats, something like that, 40 and 50, and then they got 47 seats. The Mapai got 16, 17, much, much less. You get it? So the dominant force in the politics is on the left. The Communist Party, which did exist in Israel, in the late 50s, they only get voted by the Arabs. I mean, there's a few crazy Jewish communists here and there, but the overwhelming majority of votes gets by the Arabs, which means they're marginalized. Nobody cares what they say. Ben Gurion, as a matter of policy, successfully sought in the 1950s to co-opt the Mapam and Achdut Avodah into a coalition. Here's one of the posters from that time. This is wonderful. Here's from the Mapam. So he said, we don't want to be part of coalition, it's a coalition. We want to be part of a goalitzia. Goel means disgusting, right? Right? Which you can see over here, there's Ben Gurion, and there's a guy with a hat, so he's religious, you follow? And here's somebody from the Liberal Party, from the capitalists. We want a poalitzia, right? For the workers, okay? Where everybody's wearing the kibbutz uniform. That's nice for propaganda. That didn't get too much votes, I'll tell you right now. In 49, by the first election, and in 51, by the second election, Ben Gurion insisted that the Mapam has to stay out of the government. They're dangerous, because they were too pro-Russia and too infatuated with communism. But by 1955, when they had the elections over there, the Mapai lost a lot of seats, and they only got 40, because of the Kessner trial. And also, by this time, the Mapam was disillusioned because of all the Arab raids into Israel, that the Soviet Union, although it's a good country, isn't God anymore, right? They were demoted from God to a saint. So Ben Gurion said like this, I want the Mapam to come into the government. It was a big change in Israeli politics. I want to bring them into the government so to co-opt them, so to speak. They should be, because after all, the Mapam had this big, very socialist ideology. But remember, as far as patriotism is concerned, all the big fighters in the Palmach were from the Mapam. You understand? The head of Achdut Avodah, also same kind of party. The head was a Yigal Alon. So Ben Gurion saying like this: "What do you come on in? So we'll fight in the like Jews do. We'll fight in the cabinet, but we really agree with more than we do." So if he did succeed in doing this, and he did do so, and the Mapam and the Mapai stayed connected till today, actually, if this is true, then what it means is he silenced them as a left-wing criticism of his government. You follow? You're not going to see from the Mapam strong arguments against the military government over the Arabs. Strong arguments because Ben Gurion is having too unyielding of a policy. The Mapam and Achdut Avodah were part of the government that fought the Sinai campaign, for example. You see? And so Ben Gurion was able to craft an Israeli body politic that was overwhelmingly in favor of his harsh policies as he saw it. The cabinet of 55, 59, as I say before, had significant elements of the socialist movement. So it's basically all the left-wingers minus the communists or part of the established part of the government. And in this case, he really emasculated the pro-Arab left. I mean, guys like Martin Buber were, looked at like weirdos. You understand? No, he says a German Jewish intellectual, he doesn't understand, whatever. But it's not real. Since his government includes all the Zionist leftist parties, so who was the leader of the opposition in the parliament in the time of Ben Gurion? Menachem Begin. Right? Menachem Begin is not going to say, "Oh, you're too far to the right. You're too harsh against the Arabs." I mean, Begin is more contemptuous and more unyielding to Arabs than Ben Gurion. So you understand this is a fundamental dynamic. If you don't understand, you understand how Israel operated in those years. There was a huge consensus, and there was no active opposition against the policies that I just laid out. Yes, the Arabs are an irresistible force, but Israel is an immovable object. You follow? They're not giving in nothing. And the overwhelming majority of the Israeli body politic, it has a consensus, strong consensus of these matters. They may fight over religion and the state, yeshivas, they may fight over the Lavon affair, they may fight, but not over what really, as they see, not over what really counts. The fact of a quote-unquote leftist government pursuing strong nationalist policies with an opposition coming from the right wing will be a basic feature of Israel during its first 30 years. Okay? Till Begin wins. In other words, under Ben Gurion, Sharet, Yitzhak Rabin, Golda Meir, Levi Eshkol, all those guys had a situation I just described to you. The opposition is coming from Begin. All the left-wing parties are part of the government. They're all pursuing Ben Gurionist type policies, more or less. So there didn't even exist within Israel any kind of significant, real voice in the Knesset and in places like that to question the immovable object. To question the very strong policy I just laid out. Only after Menachem Begin wins in 1977 will a strong leftist opposition arise in Israel with very complex results. Right? Because Begin became the prime minister, eventually you get a situation, as you can see over here, where the leaders of the Ben Gurion party, because that's what Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin were, they were leaders of the Ben Gurion party, because now they're in the opposition, and they were to the left, so they start attacking the government from the left, so that created, for the first time ever, the factor that I just described to you, which is there emerges strong arguments. Oh, you got to be more giving to the Palestinians, as you see in this picture. You got to be less harsh. You got to be this, that, and the other. Didn't exist prior to 1977. In this regard, in this very narrow regard, we see with hindsight, the election of the Likud in Menachem Begin was a disaster. You get what I'm saying? Because until that happened, there was no left in the real sense. But after that happened, the Shor Sek emerged. I mean, look over here. He was a general in the Palmach. Shimon Peres, you know what he was doing over there. They had very different identities prior to 1977. Agreed? They had these are two, what shall I say, spear carriers of Ben Gurionism. Literally. Yes, I mean, he actually, Peres created the spear, and Rabin is through it. I mean, they were really very strong nationalists. And then afterwards, it changes. So you never know the unexpected results of the electoral process. The Sinai, now, from the point of view of the Arabs, this isn't right. It should be that our overwhelming force against the Jews should force the Zionist state to crack from within because of the hatred and pressure exerted from all the neighboring states without example. And it doesn't happen. Right? As a matter of fact, the Sinai campaign totally frustrates the Arab nationalists because it seems like Israel isn't going anywhere very soon. So you understand what I'm saying? When the intellectuals talk to each other, so they say the overwhelming power of the idea of the Arab nationalist movement and the Ba'athist party and the Arab Third Way, this itself will eradicate the last vestiges of colonialism within the Middle East. Blah, blah, blah. But what do you do about that? You understand? Reality gets in the way. And so it's not great. And then it gets worse. In the late 50s, they find that Israel gets a bomb. That's definitely not on the Arab play bill, right? This is not part of the play. So what happens? And so what happens in the late 50s is they don't concentrate on Israel. They concentrate on Algeria, which receives their main efforts in the years 57 to 61. Okay? Here's de Gaulle. Right? Here's de Gaulle visiting Algiers, trying to give him the bad news that France is... Now, in the first round, he said, we're going to support the French Algerians and, be mechazik and all the rest of it. In the long run, in 1960, who gave in? 57 to 61 are the peak years of the French fighting the Algerians. Consequently, they are the peak years of Israel friendship with France. You get it? Because they were always fighting the Algerians, they needed anti-Arab support. Right? The Arab states like Nasser is all supplying the Algerians with weapons and trying to undermine France everywhere. And Israel has good intelligence resources and things like this. So the maximum years of Israel-French relations are 57 to 61. Those are the years, as I pointed out, when Shimon Peres gets the A-bomb from them. That's why it happened. But in the long run, as you know, in here I'm going to end on something rather, once again, the unintended consequences. Israel has a respite. In 57-61, there was no pressure in the international community to solve the refugee problem, to fix the borders. I told you, Eisenhower had his mind on other things. But eventually, in 1962, the Arabs prevail in Algeria. And then with Algeria past them, so they've taken over everything that's Arab, with one exception. The Arab nationalists will turn to the remaining problem, as they see it, which is the problem of Palestine. The years after 62, 66, we'll see the birth of the PLO, which never happened before. It will create an unprecedentedly dangerous situation for Israel. Right? Now, the problem is, by that time, Ben-Gurion will be gone, and he'll be followed by someone nowhere near as eloquent or clear-sightedly forceful in making the case against the Arabs, against the Palestinians. Because Ben-Gurion was a good talker, especially in this regard. Eshkol is a nice guy, and I know they write books now to try to build him up and all the rest of it. He wasn't that great. And he certainly was no inspiring leader in Israel's existential struggle against what I'm talking about over here. Ben-Gurion was a stark guy. You follow his speeches, he could articulate in ways that I can't do why we're right and they're wrong and they can all jump in a lake. You understand? So it would be, no. So the period after 61 will be the beginning of Israel on the defensive, which is not a good thing. Those who pointed to Ben-Gurion's many mistakes, and he certainly made them, will miss him in the new dangerous environment, which never existed in the years I'm talking about. The Arabs will be stark, but the Israelis will increasingly go peacenik. Right? But it did not happen in 57 to 61. So therefore these years have a very specific character, and we are done for tonight. What's that? What was the reason for this? Oh, that's a long story. That's a long story.